In this video, I will talk about the neural correlates of relative pitch and how it associates to the Mozart effect. The neural substrates underlying relative pitch are linked to perceptual constancy, working memory, and executive control. Perceptual constancy means the tendency of an observer to perceive familiar objects as unchanging even when observing from various angles, distances, or lighting. For instance, we perceive this door as having a constant rectangular shape no matter the angle we are observing it from. We also know that these four photos refer to the same door. People with nice relative pitch recognize a melody no matter which key this melody transposes into. However, those who show a strong tendency to rely on absolute pitch may have difficulty of recognizing the same tune at different pitch levels. Namely, they may hardly maintain the perceptual constancy for melodic contour. Working memory is one of the brain's executive functions. It allows us to work with information without losing track of what we're doing. Working memory processes interact with long-term memory systems to interpret the meaning of stimuli. When using relative pitch to identify melodic intervals, we store the heard pitches as short-term memory, then compare them with the interval information retrieving from our long-term memory. Increased activation at two core brain regions of working memory was found in a task of melodic interval identification. One area is the interparietal sulcus, which may temporarily store information. Another area is the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which supports manipulation of information. Do people use their working memory when listening to music? Researchers delved into the question in this brain imaging study. In the experiment, absolute pitch musicians and non-absolute pitch musicians were presented with tone sequences, then were asked to make a decision whether the last or second to last tone was the same or different from the first tone. It showed that absolute pitch musicians tended to activate the left superior temporal sulcus, namely the semantic neural circuits, to complete this task. On the other hand, more activation in the right superior parietal lobule and interparietal sulcus were found in musicians without absolute pitch. Namely, they mostly use relative pitch capacity and the neural circuits of working memory to complete the task. Repeated use of a motif throughout a composition helps to glue it together as a unified piece of music. We recognize motifs by recruiting the hippocampus and working memory regions, including the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and supplementary motor area. This study pointed to a general capacity of the interparietal sulcus for transforming high-level auditory information. Participants were asked to discriminate between the target and comparison patterns, to judge whether it's the same simple melody condition. Or the harder one, the transposed melody condition. It showed that the latter condition revealed greater activation in the cortex within the interparietal sulcus bilaterally. Interestingly, activity within the right interparietal sulcus predicted task performance in the transposed melody condition. In this figure, the square mark represented the musicians, who perform with higher accuracy in the transposed melody task than the non-musician participants. This study investigated the neuroanatomical correlates of musicianship and absolute pitch. Among the 49 musician participants, the brain structures of 12 strongest and 12 weakest performers in the absolute pitch test were further analyzed. Surprisingly, a significant finding was in the direction of the thinner cortex in some brain areas of the better absolute pitch group, including the thinner inferior parietal lobe and the thinner and smaller supplementary motor area, which are both associated with working memory and relative pitch. Executive functions make possible mentally playing with ideas, taking the time to think before acting, meeting novel and unanticipated challenges, resisting temptations, and staying focused. It is noteworthy that executive functions correlated with relative pitch are linked to spatial skills and mathematical ability. Research revealed that when people are viewing mathematical formulas than general narratives, their posterior parietal activation is stronger, and this pattern is significant no matter on professional mathematicians or normal controls. It suggested that unlike sentence comprehension and general semantic knowledge, high-level mathematical thinking makes minimal use of language areas and instead recruits circuits initially involved in space and number. The blue brain regions, including the interparietal sulcus, are involved when processing mathematical knowledge. These regions are similar to the neural basis of relative pitch. The green brain regions, mainly the superior temporal lobe, are involved during the retrieval of semantic knowledge. These regions are similar to the neural basis of absolute pitch. The interparietal sulcus also supports the neurocognitive mechanism of continuous dimensions, such as time and space. Regarding spatial skills, mental rotation is a cognitive ability often studied by scientists. You probably have seen this question in the intelligence test, finding out if your brain can flip, rotate, and piece together images in 3 dimensions. Mental rotation and arithmetic were found to activate the interparietal sulcus. Actually, the relative pitch may also overlap with them. There might be a bidirectional relationship between spatial and musical ability, whereby an increase in spatial ability will lead to enhanced musical ability, because the 2 processes share a common representational framework. Vice versa. People with relatively poor pitch perception, known as a musical disorder, amusha, not only cannot recognize obvious pitch differences, but their mental rotation ability is also worse than ordinary people. In support of this proposal, children who are randomly selected to take part in music lessons subsequently outperform their peers, who receive either computer lessons or no intervention, on tests of spatial skills, and well-trained orchestra musicians show enhanced mental rotation abilities. You have probably heard of the Mozart effect, which is consistent with the aforementioned proposal. The Mozart effect refers to the claim that listening to the first movement of Mozart's Sonata K448 may temporarily boost spatial reasoning performance. Although major challenges were raised to the existence of the Mozart effect, we can still reflect a bit and analyze the musical characteristics of the movement. The processing of repetitions and variations of musical motifs in this movement may be underpinned by working memory processes. Furthermore, the transition from the first theme to the second theme was presented like a fascinating transition of geometric patterns. Perhaps some neural circuits activated by the music are also involved in spatial processing, and thus temporarily improve spatial reasoning skills in certain people. Tasks of relative pitch were found to recruit several brain areas in the frontal lobe. For example, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the inferior frontal gyrus, and the supplementary motor area, showed increased activation when participants were judging melodic intervals. Another research also pointed out that compared to musicians without absolute pitch and with relative pitch, musicians with absolute pitch showed weaker activation in the supplementary motor area and inferior frontal gyrus. This hypoactivation may reflect a weaker sense of relative pitch. Given that these brain regions are part of the executive control network, it's reasonable that training relative pitch may improve executive functions.